I'm excited for this next panel on enhancing software and technology supply chain security. So let's jump right in. Joining us for this panel is Jermaine Roebuck, the Deputy Associate Director of Threat Hunting at CISA. We also have David Wheeler, the Director of Open Source Supply Chain Security at the Linux Foundation. And then finally, Carol Woody, the Technical Manager of Software Engineering at the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. And moderating this session is the NICE Conference Planning Committee's academic co-chair, Dr. Raquel Hill. Dr. Hill is the chair of the Computer and Information Sciences Department at Spelman College. And so with that, Raquel, take it away.
Thank you so much for having us, and thank you panelists for joining us today. I wanted to start with just a short definition of the challenge that we're facing. So our panel today, enhancing software and technology supply chain security. And when you look at, how people are defining supply chain security, it says the definition, one definition that I found was securing the software supply chain entails knowing exactly what components are being used in your software products, everything that impacts your code as it goes from development to production. And the first question I wanted to begin with is this a sufficient definition of the problem? And are there things that this definition does not capture? And I wanted to start with Carol, if you could, comment on that.
Excuse me, I have to unmute. One of the key challenges that we see is that a lot of people don't realize that they are running software, and they don't realize where the technology is and what they're actually using, and companies don't know what they have connected. And so I think we have, while that's a nice goal to know everything, I think we have to start by recognizing that people have to really understand that software is everywhere. And you've got all of these pieces, most of which you don't own and you don't really control, actually impacting a lot of the key functionality and business capabilities that you're trying to manage. And many of these contain vulnerabilities, and managing those and understanding them is one of the key challenges that we have. And ignorance is one of our biggest hurdles to begin with.
Thank you, Carol. Jermaine.
So I would have to agree with Carol, right? So that people don't realize software is actually in everything. And a lot of what we're seeing in terms of attacks, we see a lot of adversaries actually going after some of the software in places that you don't necessarily realize that it's there. We've noticed where there's been a number of different appliances and things that you would consider traditional hardware that are running software code that you didn't necessarily realize was the underpinnings of that particular appliance. And a lot of that stuff has been outdated. So software, it's in your cars, it's in your hardware appliances, your firewalls. Software is just the underpinnings for much of the technology that are in use today.
David.
Yeah, I'm going to answer to your initial question. No, that's not an adequate definition, because in fact, knowing what's in there isn't really the goal. The goal is to secure your software supply chain. Knowing what's in there might be a useful intermediate step, but I don't care which screws are in my dishwasher, and I may not really care exactly what software is in there, but what I do care about is, does it work properly? Does it, and among other things, is it adequately secure for purpose? And that's really the key step. I think trying to identify the components can be a useful way to start down that path. But if your solution is, oh, look, I have a list, that's useless. The goal is security, not to get a list.
Okay, thank you. So I guess the second question that I have is, how difficult is this problem, do you think? And I want to start with you, David.
Difficult. I guess the problem is which problem are we talking about here? To truly make the software that everyone's using very secure against adversaries is not going to be a trivial problem, because we've been ignoring it for the most part for decades. And attackers will simply take whatever is the easiest path. So saying, oh, we're going to fix this one little thing and make it slightly better, the attackers will just route around that and do something else. So we're going to have to look at this more holistically, take real actionable steps. I'm sure that there's a whole bunch of things I know I'm sure we need to do. One I quickly put the ground in early is we need to educate our software developers. Trying to secure the insecurable in operations is kind of hopeless. Okay, we've got to make our software more secure to start with. And oh wait, that means we have to teach our software developers, who for the most part, nobody requires that they know how to develop secure software. And so they don't. My Uber driver a week ago was a senior at Purdue, computer science. Did they told him anything about security? Not a thing, nothing. And I don't want to call out Purdue particularly as endemic. We don't require it, and we're getting exactly what we should expect. If we want to change, we're going to have to change our societal expectations.
Okay, David, and you're getting so far ahead of me, answering all of the questions on my list. But Carol, can you comment on the difficulty of the problem of trying to secure the supply chain? And I think David has summed it up for us, but is there anything that you would like to add to that?
Well, no one really agrees on what the supply chain is, but we have to recognize that it's not one. There are feeds of software coming in from third parties at every step along the development cycle, at every step in terms of technology usage. And many of those are feeds into companies that then send their software to other companies. So when we talk about a vulnerability, it's potentially introduced 4 or 5 companies down the chain, and then if they fix it, those fixes have to ripple all the way up to actually get to the end product where somebody is depending on that software for some major mission to have it function. We have a mindset that says that, well, I can take a few assets and just protect those, and then everything else, well, if something happens, it's no big deal. Well, that was fine until we started connecting everything with everything. And now, so suddenly we now have a way of allowing the attacker to link to things that we didn't know they could get to before. So this attack surface and ways in which our systems can be compromised is basically expanding exponentially. The most latest issue we've been dealing with is ransomware that's coming in through the supply chain and getting triggered, and people are trying to have to figure out how to respond to it and deal with it on products that they didn't even know in many cases had software in it. So the level of ignorance is a real challenge at many layers. I agree with David that we have to educate the developers, but we also have to educate the acquirers because it's a push-pull process. And if you don't understand what you're buying and you have no clue how to deal with it, then you're going to basically collect challenges that you don't know what to do with. And if this is your situation in your organization that you don't really know where your software is, then you need to start educating yourself. And maybe that gets back to what your initial definition was, Raquel. That's kind of the first step of users educating themselves in terms of how big is my problem space, is really understanding what have you got and where's it coming from and what might happen if something goes wrong.
So Jermaine, do you have anything to add to the difficulty of the problem?
Yeah, I want to start with an example that happened recently. So there was a piece of software that was developed a number of years ago. I'm talking 10 plus years ago. That was pretty prevalent in cars, trains, transportation, all over the place. And what we found in that particular situation, there happened to be a vulnerability in that software. But what we found, we couldn't trace it back to one single entity. that piece of software had gotten licensed to a number of different organizations who then modified it slightly to suit their individual needs. And then from that, they then, license it further down the supply chain. So now you're like 5 or 6 companies deep that have modified this piece of code and done different things to it to suit their needs. But now once a vulnerability is introduced from the beginning, from the software beginnings, now you have a really murky problem where who's responsible for patching that piece of software? Who's going to roger up and say, hey, we're going to take point and modifying and patching that code? It becomes difficult because once you patch that piece of software, all the different iterations of that software that then got modified by all these different companies, how does it affect all of those different systems that they're loaded into? So this is where I provide sort of a counterpoint to David's argument earlier, where I think that the software bill of materials, or SBOM, I think is important, but it's only one small ingredient. So understanding what's in your software package, I think is important. I think on top of that, you need to make sure you have software development standards. So how is this thing put together? How was it made? And I think even more interesting is when you get P-certs involved. So product security incident response teams who are responsible for maintaining the package, searching for and responding to security vulnerabilities that get brought up by security researchers and things like that. And then on top of that, I think end users have a huge responsibility here, because at the end of the day, the end user has to make sure that that particular product is configured correctly. They got to make sure that they have a resilient and well thought out security architecture to sort of mitigate or limit the risk. I think there's a number of compounding things that make up sort of this issue of software supply chain security, and it isn't just one. There isn't a silver bullet for it, if you will.
Thank you. I mean, this is such great information that you guys are providing today. And, I wanted to also talk about, like, how did we get here? And, is this problem new? And I think we've seen, just versions of this, throughout, our history, right? When we've seen like software become more prevalent in everything that we buy, and we've seen our connectedness just grow exponentially, right? But also, one question that just came to me that's not even on my list of questions to ask was, how did the app developer actually impact this? And like when everyone became a developer of an app and everyone was, selling their new app, but in that type of creative ecosystem, right? No one is an expert on anything. So now I'm more reliant on getting pieces from other places, and I have no control over that. What impact did that impact this problem? And David is chomping at the bit. He's raising his hand. And Jermaine, I was going to go to you first because I got my whole little thing going, but I'm gonna let David go, and then we'll do Jermaine and then Carol. And Carol, I'll start with you the next time. Go ahead, David.
It's not a new problem in one sense, but it's far more intense over the years. I've been around long enough to remember many decades back, applications were typically developed completely by a single organization. Maybe you reused the operating system, but that was it. All the code was a single group. But the problem, of course, is that doesn't scale. People want more and more functionality. You can't, how many people are you going to add to your teams? Nowadays, people bring in lots and lots of third-party software. It's far more intense. The good news is we have mostly solved the reuse problem. But like many other things, the cause of problems is previous solutions. Because we're now able to reuse far more software, we're able to build out far more functionality in far less time and resources, but we're building on lots of other components, which means that a vulnerability in those other components, which may bring in others, which may bring others at very many tiers, not just 5 or 6, there may be a very deep level of tiers. and one after the other that bring in potential vulnerabilities. So it's not new, it's the scale that's new. And the EU made an interesting point in NICE. They're arguing that at least some organizations, not all, but some are protecting their production systems much better. Congratulations, hooray. Here's the problem. Now that those operational systems are better protected, the attackers are looking for the easy attack. Oh, it's going to be easier to attack their supply chains. They're not looking. And so while they weren't, and so the good news is at least some organizations are getting on top of the game, but as a result, attackers are increasingly attacking supply chains.
Okay, so Jermaine, what would you like to add to that? Unmute yourself, yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to unmute first. So I would have to agree with David, right? This isn't new, right? Even outside of just software security within itself, we've seen time and time again, at least incident responses that I've been a part of, where the attackers go after the low-hanging fruit. So it may be some small company with a 10-person shop and only one of them does IT part-time. They'll attack that location first to worm their way into their intended targets. And we've seen that quite a few times. So even from the software supply chain sort of perspective, if you take a look at some of the more recent events, what they've done is they've attacked the companies that supply the software to the intended targets that they're trying to get into. And in some cases, they've been able to successfully breach these organizations. They've been able to get into their update supply chain. Then, the company unwittingly pushes out this update that then goes far and wide. And now you trust this particular package that you just downloaded because it's an update from a company that you trust. But now you inadvertently sort of loaded a backdoor into your environment, and now the attacker is using said backdoor to move laterally and to cause havoc in your environment. So this isn't new. This has been going on for years. There's been plenty of examples of that, and I think that as time goes on, we'll continue to see more and more of this type of activity, even outside of nation states, but even down to criminal hackers, et cetera, to use this sort of method to cause havoc.
Okay, Carol, anything that you would like to add to that?
I think we have to recognize that a lot of the software that we're assembling together and creating these wonderful integrations, like a car that's run by software, or a ship that automatically runs itself, or a plane that flies itself, all of those different pieces are lots of different parts that are extremely specialized, and no one person can really know all of that and know the details of how to interface with all of the different sensors and pieces and parts to put it together. One of the diagrams we have of a car and software has 100 different engineering units, and each one of those is made by a different company. So you are looking at, just for a single vehicle like that, a huge scale of integration. That has allowed us to really leverage a lot of the capability and put a lot of functionality and features. So yes, we're driving toward wanting this, and every new iPhone that comes out, or Android or whatever, has more functions and features. So that means it's got more apps and more capability there and more software. And we're creating these platforms that can continually expand to include more and more software. So we're driving in the direction of wanting the features, wanting the capability, wanting the ease of use, and putting all of our banking on our phone, and all of our healthcare and medications and everything on our phone, and then having our car drive itself. All of those pieces come with a cost of software, and we're not thinking about it in terms of the risk side, just the new features and functions that we want to use.
And Jermaine, we have a question from the audience, and I'll start with you on this one. It said, the question asked, isn't it also important that I also know the tools used to develop the software? I didn't hear that mentioned in the initial question about what supply chain security for software is.
So I think the tools that go into the development is a pretty interesting aspect. I do think that that is also important. depending on which tool is being used, that could introduce different types of vulnerabilities into the software that you're creating. So I think that's also an important point that also needs to be recognized as well. But David, I welcome your thoughts on that.
So I'm not sure I understood your question, Jermaine. My thoughts on which part?
So I believe the speaker was asking about the tools that go into the development of the software and the security of that. And I was explaining that I think that's an interesting aspect. I think that depending on the tool being used, that could introduce potential risk to the software that's being developed, but I don't have a ton of research into that.
That's actually the subject of my PhD, so I do know a little bit about this topic. Are the tools important? Sure, and I think it is useful to have that tooling information. But if nothing else, so that you can reproduce and make sure that the same tool produces the same results. Can tools insert vulnerabilities? Absolutely, we've seen that happen occasionally. It's not the most common kind of attack, but I do think that once we kind of burn off the more common kinds of risks, that would be an area worth pursuing increasingly over time.
Carol, is there anything you would like to add to that?
No, I'll defer to David on that one. He did his PhD on it.
Okay, all right. So Carol, let me start with you. Are there things that we're doing right?
I think that there is a lot of increased understanding that the supply chain is important. And a lot of this, though, has only come recently. And so we're still in the learning mode. I do see a lot more people reaching out to begin to understand, what are my supply chains? Where am I going to potentially be impacted? And before, we were just ignoring all of that. But what I haven't seen is a good way that that's being integrated into organizations, so that once they understand what's going on, they can do an overall organization or a system risk assessment to begin to really affect and understand the mission risk that they're accepting. Too frequently, a lot of these choices and decisions are made at lower levels in the organization, and they're not communicating among all their different stovepipes to know what information is coming in. On a simplistic note, very few organizations really look at how they're already being attacked and mine that information and take it in as part of how they do their next selection of software, so that at least if you bring in a new piece, it can deal with the attacks you're already dealing with. We just don't see those kind of information sharing within an organization, much less across organizations. So I think there's a lot of data that's being collected. I think there's a lot of pockets of understanding that are growing, but we're not doing a very good job of leveraging them yet.
And Jermaine, are we here, as Carol mentioned, that we're beginning, the thing that we're doing right is actually acknowledging that the supply chain is important and we have to secure it, right? Have we not done that because we've actually ignored security and ignored secure development, and we haven't really made specific efforts to integrate like security requirements in the product that we're building? Is this how we got here?
I think that's part of it. I think going back to an earlier comment at the beginning, where people just aren't trained appropriately, like our software development teams, our software engineers, going back to the early days, security was an afterthought. Security was baked in or bolted on, wasn't baked in, but it was bolted on much, much later. And we're getting to a point, to a realization that we understand that security has to be baked in the beginning, and people have to be thinking about that. I also think that in terms of your question, I think we're headed down the right track, but I think we're very much in the nascent or the very early stages of this. We haven't had a real conversation up until the last couple of years about SBOM, about P-certs. In my time here at DHS, I've only seen a couple of P-certs that are actually really good at what they do. I think a lot of organizations don't necessarily invest in time, money, and personnel into their P-certs and into software supply chain security. So I think a lot of that needs to change. And a lot of that comes with making sure that they understand what the risks are. A lot of people buy pieces of software and they don't necessarily understand the underlying risk. They look at a name, they say they think that that name or that company is reputable, and they just go with it. They don't necessarily understand what their vulnerability management program, what their bug bounties and things like that look like. So I think we still have a long way to go, but I'm glad that right now we are acknowledging that this is a problem, and that we finally have some experts that are getting together, that are speaking loudly, and that are starting to gain some traction, in my opinion.
David, is there anything that you would like to add to that? If not, I'm going to toss you a new question.
I'm going to basically agree with Jermaine that we have there are exceptions, but for the most part we haven't paid attention. If you look at the requirements, it must be secure, maybe. But that doesn't actually. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, we don't know. We're not going to worry about that. You won't get any funding to do that anyway. So we've got to. There are people who are moving past that, who moved past that in the past. We've got to do it everywhere else too.
Okay, we have another question from the audience, and this one asks: supply chain cannot be managed once you cross national borders. What cross-boundary leadership skills can we get across to practitioners and students alike so that they can influence decisions they do not manage? Ooh, that's a tough one. I don't know, Carol. Well, David, go ahead.
I mean, I don't understand why this is hard to manage. Welcome to the modern economy. This started happening in 1980. For those of you who thought that every part was made in the U.S., I'm really sorry to report to you that wasn't true when DEC VT100s were around. Most of the chips were Japanese. Guess what? Still true now. There's a global economy, and it includes software. Anybody who thinks that I've got a U.S. company and it's all U.S. developers, if you want to be a U.S. company, you go to Delaware, give them less than $100. Congratulations, you're a U.S. company. I'm being a little facetious here, but the reality is it's a global supply chain, and we need to treat it as such because that's the reality. Software is developed globally. I work for a particular organization where we managed development of software across national boundaries all the time. It's not a new construct. It's normal. The weird thing is doing something only within one country. The commercial world's been doing this for a long time. The issue really is we need to get more people to understand how to develop secure software. We need to help them identify what to do, how to actually accomplish that. But and in the end, there's an acquisition learning process. When you select components, why do you think that's more secure? Hey, they've got a name. I've heard of them on TV. They must be more secure. That's a terrible reason to make a decision. Okay, we're gonna have to have people who acquire stuff based on actual information, not on what they saw advertised.
So Carol, as far as, is this a security knowledge or lack of knowledge issue as it relates to leadership? Or are there any cross-boundary leadership skills that are needed?
I think a lot of it boils back to basic risk management, and most leadership focuses entirely on cost and schedule. We are driven to meet arbitrary needs and tag deadlines and timetables for when we're going to have things implemented without really looking at what does the job entail. And in many cases, people underneath are taking shortcuts to meet these arbitrary deadlines. And there's nothing in the cost and schedule mindset that says what risks are you accepting by doing that? We don't have organizations that are structured to think about risk. Many of them that I've worked with, when you talk to senior leadership, they'll report that no one has ever given them a software risk. Well, if nobody's given you a software risk, I can guarantee you that the lower parts of your organization are just not reporting the problems. And so you're ignorant. That's the reality that we have right now. So we have to, in addition to having acquisition think about software and what needs to be done, leadership for organizations really need to understand where software can create risks and create an environment where people can report problems and they can begin to solve them. Because if you don't know about it, you're not going to be able to do anything about it until it's too late. And what we're trying to do is get ahead of the problem. I think we've got some very good early warning signs with issues that we see in the press every day. And we should take those as learning opportunities and figure out how our organizations and our systems could be affected in the same way. And what do we need to do to address it?
Thank you. And I think, David, you kicked us off on this trusted versus trustworthy line. And there is now a question that's come up, and it's saying, the question asks, how open source development organizations ensure secure process and provide attestation required? So I had a question that I was going to ask about. Are there techniques that we should be using, or technology that we should be using in our in developing secure software, secure processes, secure components? David, you talked about basically an issue of, trusted or trustworthiness, and I'm probably adding words to you. But Jermaine, I want you to talk about this from the context of this question. How can we ensure secure process and provide attestation, right? Is that a part of building like secure software that we're not really doing right now?
So I would say no, we're not really doing it right now. I don't know if anyone, and David and Carol can correct me here, but I don't know anyone I don't know of any standards organization that's doing an attestation to say, yes, this piece of software meets standards, right? I think of this in a couple of different ways, and this goes back to sort of Carol's point that I want to tease out is within organizations themselves, you have the leadership that they have no idea what software is in their environment, let alone going a layer deeper to understand what that software is made of, right? So they don't understand patch levels, any of that. On top of that, is that software that's running, is it actually doing what you would expect it to do, right? So going back and verifying what is your risk and what is sort of your trust level of that piece of software, right? So I think that goes along to, I think as we lean and start moving into the future, since we have these global supply chains and supply chains are quite complicated, we have to get to a point where you have to understand the risk and whether or not you trust that. And if you don't trust it, then how do you monitor it to make sure that that piece of software isn't doing something unusual or abnormal, which would then be an indication that you have a much larger issue. So I think that's part of where we need to head. As far as software supply chain security is concerned, understanding risk, understanding trustworthiness, and the ability to quickly spot and understand that, what is running is not actually running the way you would anticipate it to run.
Carol, what would you like to add to that?
We need to think about who's really responsible for the supply chain in the organization. It's a job that nobody really owns right now. I think until you really assign it to someone and they start to really focus on what are the issues and begin to push to make sure other people who are parts of these decisions really understand it, that you're going to get a lot of heads ducking because everyone's too busy with other things. Oh, that's always somebody else's problem. If you don't have somebody in charge of your supplier management, then you need to really think about that as a starting point. You establish a relationship through an acquisition with a supplier. Who maintains it and manages it through the rest of its relationship with your organization? We have a lot of this unmanaged interactions, essentially. A patch arrives electronically. Well, if that you're going ahead and applying it, who's actually doing the supplier management? Your computer. Do you really trust them with everything? Maybe not, because they're not going to be aware if there's an issue. They're acting mechanically. So we have to look at where and how are we setting up these trust relationships, and how are we just doing basic good management of what's happening in our organizations?
David, one, I'm going to spice it up a little bit for you. Do we know what it means to be trustworthy?
We know in principle, but details are hard. I mean, if you look up in a dictionary what trustworthiness means, but it just simply repeats it back to, it's worthy of trust. It's not just that you're trusting it, because trust is a decision. It's that it's justifiable. But I think there's an honest way to add to that, which is it's a risk management approach. What you're trying to do is determine what is the risk of trusting this component. And in my mind, when you pick a component to bring in, that's a very, very good time to ask, hey, is this adequately trustworthy for my purpose? Not, is it perfect according to some platonic ideal, but do I have reason to believe that's trustworthy? And there's, in fact, many, many ways to do it. Jermaine, there are certainly ways that people have in the past tried to evaluate against various criteria. I mean, we can go back to the Orange Book. There's common criteria. There's problems with those, among others, large costs, long time frames. I work for the Linux Foundation. We've funded a whole lot of very specific pointed security evaluations or audits where we, here's some software we're going to look in very specifically. But there's not one size fits all. But there are things that projects can do to make more secure software. I could list some later if you'd like me to, but I think when you're looking at suppliers, you can ask questions about, hey, what are you doing to make it secure? What are you doing that makes me more confident that it's okay for me to trust you? I can identify some things that hopefully would give you increased confidence and therefore suggest that it's trustworthy. Does that help a little bit?
Yes, it does. So I want to, we're approaching time, but I want to close out with some words on how do we educate the next generation of security professionals. And we've talked about different roles, and I think that there may be different learning outcomes for those different roles, but if each of you could speak on how do we begin this training process? And I'll start with you, Jermaine.
All right, so I think it starts, I want to say it starts in elementary school, but maybe that's going back too far. But certainly middle school and high school, we have all sorts of ages. Like even my young son, he's 11 years old. He's already learning how to code, right? So I think teaching them early on the importance of security and making them aware, I think has to start at the very beginning. I think that for those that are already, gone through their programs and what have you, I think we have to implement standards similar to how we've done for all of our cybersecurity defenders, that they have to go back and learn basic skills. I think all of these things have to be done so that security is at the forefront of everyone's mind when they're sitting down to put together code, or even those who are responsible for doing the user acceptance testing and things like that happen after some of the development. But I think all the way through the entire life cycle of that development, you have to have folks that understand security and that are looking out for those potential pitfalls that could lead to huge problems later. I wish I could say that would be the silver bullet. I think at the end of the day, you will always have some sort of bug or some sort of vulnerability in the code. But as long as someone is, doing their due diligence to make sure they produce a product that is as secure as possible at that point in time, and somebody is constantly monitoring and taking a look at that software and making sure that they're responsive as new vulnerabilities are uncovered, I think that'll definitely put us in on the right path.
Carol, if you could comment, and also there was a question that came in while Jermaine was talking, and the question asked, how does Dev Secure Ops fit into that plan? And so I don't know if that's going to go back to you, Jermaine, specifically, but Carol, if you could talk about how do we educate the next generation of security professionals and address the question from the audience, if you can.
Well, in terms of the next generation, I think we have to start by providing materials for the people that teach developers and software engineers about security, because in some sense, the teachers that are transitioning our current technology don't understand security either. We don't have programs with a lot of information that they can pick up and learn themselves. I know a lot of teachers in elementary school are no less than the students, and the students are actually running the software on their own. That's not the right kind of environment to provide structure and knowledge and organization around this. We've been motivated to put out a lot of software, but we haven't put out a lot of guidance, training material, and understanding to go with it. I know my organization has been attempting this with curriculum input for organizations, as well as online certification, which is available to anyone to take, and textbooks. So all of those are our core materials to start with, but we need more of that. And we're just one organization. We can't produce everything that everybody's going to need for this breadth of training. In terms of the DevSecOps pieces, we have been looking at the participants in that and the decision-making, and doing a lot of exploration in terms of how do you actually integrate cybersecurity into those environments. It's not well structured right now and not well standardized. And I think that's an area that needs more research in terms of effectiveness. I think it's got the possibility of using automation to help us with some of these issues, but only if it's structured right and well organized. And again, organizations have to integrate risk management into the pipelines, not just pushing code faster and cheaper.
David.
Okay, so first of all, I think we clearly do need to get software developers learning how to develop secure software. I emphasized that earlier. I'll quickly note that the Open Source Security Foundation, one of the first things it released was a free set of 3 courses on how to develop secure software. I mean, you can just, any developer can just go and take that. It's also publicly available on GitHub, and you can download and you incorporate that into courses, and that's available right now. So I asked about open source software. There's actually under the Open Source Security Foundation, the OpenSSF, there's the CII Best Practices badge. It's a set of criteria on what open source software projects should be doing to develop secure software. We've got over 4,000 people participating. I lead it. And if you're acquiring, you should be looking for things like, hey, does it have a CII Best Practices badge? I think we're about to rename to OpenSSF Best Practices badge. There's a couple of things that a developer should be doing, acquirers should be looking for. DevSecOps. Do you have a lot of tools in your CI pipeline that are checking for vulnerabilities as you put in commits? If not, you're already in trouble. Monitoring for known vulnerabilities and what you depend on. Enable rapid dependency updates by using package managers and good test suites. And evaluating software before you select the dependencies you're going to use. The number one problem, at least up till this year, for open source software was typo squatting. People thought they were getting in, people wanted project XY, and they would bring in project X-Y, almost the right name. Well, no matter how much a project does correctly, if you bring in some other project, that won't help. And I think I'll quickly add kind of more meta things, making it easy for your users to update and continuously improving, I think are always going to be part of this.
Well, I think, David, thank you for having the last word. We're at time, but I want to thank all of the panelists. This was a wonderful panel today. I think very informative. I thank you all for your insights. I think that this problem is not just a technical problem. We realize that we really have a human problem. And part of the solution, a major part of the solution will be training and doing it properly. And we have to start early, as Jermaine mentioned, but we also have to educate everyone in that training pipeline. And so we have an educational supply chain issue also as we look at our software and technology supply chain problem. But I thank you so much for sharing with us today. And I'm going to turn this back over to Brian.
Thanks, Dr. Hill, for leading such an exceptional, fantastic discussion. Really grateful for your leadership in the program committee and what you do to help us pull together such an amazing intellectual conversation around cyber security resilience. To conclude today's symposium, I want to welcome Austin Cusack, the NICE Conference Planning Committee's government co-chair, for some closing remarks. Austin oversees cyber defense education and training at CISA. Austin, thanks so much for being here with us. I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending today. We want to thank NICE, Florida International University, and New for organizing and running the symposium. I'd also like to thank our speakers and moderators, especially Kevin Gallagher, Director English, Chief of Staff Todd, and JJ Green. It's comforting to know we have such capable and dedicated leaders trailblazing solutions to the cybersecurity problems of our increasingly interconnected world. This event is setting the standard for the profession of cybersecurity. With participation from industry, academia, government, and nonprofit, we are proof that the problems inherent with anticipating and mitigating supply chain risk affects us all. And the more we share ideas across the entirety of the cyber ecosystem, the healthier our ever-expanding networks will become. I want to point out how unique it is that we are all here right now. There are not many professions that have such a wide array of entrance points. I doubt you'd find many engineers or physicists that say, well, I was planning on going to law school, but then one day I just started messing around with physics in my spare time and boom, here I am. And yet that is a common start for many of us in the cybersecurity field. Those of us that learned the art of cybersecurity through error share our experience-based skills, those who gain cybersecurity knowledge through a traditional academic program. And we all teach and learn from each other. Why? Because we are at our core, adaptable problem solvers who share a deep curiosity for figuring things out. That goes for all of us in the cyber ecosystem, not just the technical people. Everyone from NetFlow analysts to legal counsel are here because they share the value of adaptability and gain personal fulfillment in playing a small part in protecting our society. Since I have the floor, I want to repeat the call to participate in the upcoming 2022 NICE Conference and Expo that will be held in Atlanta, Georgia on June the 6th through the 8th. This year's theme is demystifying cybersecurity, and we will have both and virtual attendance option for participants. I encourage everyone here to attend and want to let you all know that we on the NICE Planning Committee are putting in a lot of work to make the workshops and discussions interesting and impactful. Additionally, we are accepting proposals for the conference on growth and development through lifelong learning, building dimensional cybersecurity culture, hybrid roles to solve sector-specific needs, and emerging topics in cybersecurity. We need to hear more of your voices and ideas to continue improving our cybersecurity education, training, and workforce development. So please visit our website at niceconference.org/proposals for further details and to submit your proposal. Also, make sure you tune in for this year's President's Cup cybersecurity competition run by my friends in CISA. It's the competition CISA runs to find and recognize the best cybersecurity talent in the federal government. Only compete, but everyone can watch. The finals will be live streamed by CISA staff on the 9th of December, starting at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. They've put together a fun Save the World from Space Invaders scenarios with a synthwave vibe that is slightly campy, but mostly awesome. CISA has more people registered this year than ever before, and this final game will be provided in a new way that will allow more accessibility in the federal workforce competing in the event, and for the general cyber public, who will have access to use all of the challenges from this year's competition to practice and train with once the event is over. After they are posted, anyone can download this year's challenges, as well as challenges from the previous 2 competitions for free at CISA's GitHub site. We believe learning and practice of our craft can be done very effectively through gamification and competition, and it's exciting to see more fun infused into our cyber skill development. I hope everyone here can tune in and try your hand once they are posted. Again, thank you for attending today, and we look forward to seeing you in June at the NICE Conference and Expo. Back to you, Brian.
Thanks so much, Austin. So before I close, I want to leave with some really important final notes. First, I'd like everybody to join me for a virtual round of applause for our speakers, our moderators, as well as the amazing teams at FIU, New America, and NICE for putting this together. I want to give a special shout out to Paola, Barbara, Catherine, Eddie, and Jenny, and of course, Randy, for taking lead on pulling this conference together. Of course, I'm grateful for Randy's leadership in driving the conference today. And of course, the leadership at NICE, Rodney, the exceptional partnership we have with you and your team, and of course, our friends at New America. Second, I encourage you all to share your thoughts on this year's symposium. Your feedback is critical to allowing us to continuously evolve and grow the conference. You will see the link to the survey in the chat box. If you didn't get a chance to fill it out earlier, please take the opportunity to do that. That feedback is critical for us. Next slide. So I want to, again, encourage you all to join us on June 6th through 8, 2022 in Atlanta, Georgia for the 2022 NICE Conference and Expo. It's our first time back in person. We're really excited to host it in Atlanta, Georgia in 2022. So be sure to join us. You can also submit a proposal to present at next year's conference by visiting niceconference.org, as Austin pointed out. You can also reserve your hotel room with no cancellation fees, I think thanks to COVID, at the prevailing per diem rate. We encourage you to do this sooner rather than later to avoid our hotel block selling out. Finally, you can find today's recording on the NICE conference page, as well as the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy's YouTube page. I encourage you to share, tag us on social media, and continue to spread the word of the amazing work that our NICE convening does. And so last slide, I want to again thank you all for your active participation, and we look forward to seeing you at next year's conference. Thank you.